I grew up in a family where my silence never made anyone worried. In truth, I only realized that much later. When I was young, I thought not being asked about, not being noticed, was normal. I learned to sit quietly at the dinner table, finish my meal, clean up, then retreat silently into my room, as if my existence only needed to be neat and unobtrusive to be enough. Our house was in Plano, Texas. A clean suburb, straight roads, friendly neighbors, lawns trimmed on schedule. From the outside, my family looked like any other middle-class household. Parents with stable jobs, 2 sons growing up in a proper environment. People often told my parents how lucky they were, and my parents believed it too. It was just that, in that picture, I was always standing behind. My older brother Ethan was the kind of person every parent wanted to brag about. He was good at sports, excelled academically, always knew what to say at the right time. When Ethan entered a room, the atmosphere seemed brighter. When I entered, nothing changed. I didn't blame anyone. I simply observed and gradually learned to understand my place. My father, Richard Parker, was a man who valued results. He wasn't loud or violent, but every word he spoke carried weight. He believed a man had to be strong, had to prove his worth. And Ethan, in his eyes, was the clearest proof of that belief. My mother, Linda, was gentler. She cared, she asked questions, but her attention often flowed toward the place that was already used to being seen. I knew she loved me. But that love was quiet and thin enough that I had to be very careful to feel it. I remember clearly a dinner when I was 15. Ethan had just won an award in a major competition. The entire table revolved around him. My father smiled more than usual. My mother kept putting food onto his plate. I sat across from them, silently eating my portion. When the meal was nearly over, my mother turned to me and asked, "How was school today?" I answered, "Normal." She nodded, and the conversation returned to Ethan. I wasn't sad. I just took note. The comparisons in my family were rarely spoken outright. They existed in sentences like, "If only you were more like your brother," or, "Your brother is always more proactive." No one told me I was incompetent, but everything quietly said I wasn't enough. I tried. I studied harder. I did what was expected. But the more I tried, the more I felt like I was running a race where the starting line had never been mine. The moment I understood everything happened during a parent-teacher meeting. I was standing outside the room, waiting for my parents to come out. When the door opened, I heard my father say to the teacher, "The older one always makes me feel more at ease." He didn't know I heard it, or perhaps he didn't think it mattered. But to me, that sentence felt like a full stop. Not to my efforts, but to the hope that one day I would be seen as myself. From that day on, I began to withdraw. I stopped trying to explain. I stopped hoping to be praised. I learned how to exist without expecting to be chosen. I did what needed to be done, achieved what was just enough, and kept the rest to myself. My family didn't notice the change. Or maybe they did, but didn't see a reason to ask. One night, I lay in my room, staring at the ceiling and thought, maybe the problem wasn't that I was weak. Maybe I was simply born into a family that had already chosen who to place their expectations on. That thought didn't make me angry. It made me strangely calm. And in that calmness, I understood that if I didn't see myself, no one else would do it for me. I hadn't disappeared at that point. But inside the very house where I grew up, I had begun living like a shadow. And that was when my real journey quietly began. I don't remember exactly when the comparisons started to appear more frequently. Perhaps it was when I entered high school, when everything around me began to be measured by scoreboards, trophies, and who stood out more than whom. In my family, those measures didn't need to be hung on the wall. They existed in my father's gaze, in the way my mother spoke about her children to others, and in the long pauses whenever it was my turn to be mentioned. The high school years in Plano passed steadily. The campus was wide, the sports fields crowded every afternoon, and award ceremonies took place as a familiar part of school life. Ethan was always present at those events. He stood on stage, in applause, under the lights. I sat below, among the crowd, learning how to clap at the right moments and smile just enough. Whenever someone asked my parents about me, the answers were usually short. "He's fine. He's normal." Then the conversation would quickly return to Ethan. I realized that in those conversations, I wasn't a story. I was a footnote. No one intended to hurt me. But the repetition of being overlooked taught me one thing. If I didn't cause trouble, I wouldn't disappoint anyone. My father never said he was unhappy with me, but he often said things that made me understand it on my own. When Ethan got high grades, he said it was the result of hard work. When I got decent grades, he said it was what was expected. The difference was this. One was acknowledged, the other was assumed. Gradually, I stopped waiting for praise. I began to see not being scolded as a form of success. My mother sometimes noticed the imbalance. She would ask if I was okay, if I was tired. But those questions usually came after she had already given most of her attention to Ethan. I told her I was fine, because that put her at ease. I didn't want to become an emotional burden. I learned to handle my feelings on my own, even though no one had ever taught me how. Comparisons don't need to be spoken directly to carry weight. They exist in the way one person is praised in front of another, in the way all expectations are naturally directed toward one side. I didn't hate Ethan. In fact, I admired him. But as I grew older, I realized that living under someone else's shadow left me no idea who I was, beyond being the one who wasn't as good. One evening, after my family had guests over, I heard my father tell a friend that he wasn't worried about Ethan's future. Then he paused briefly before adding that I needed more time. The sentence was spoken very lightly, but I carried it with me for years afterward. It made me understand that in his eyes, I was an unsolved problem, an unproven possibility, and therefore, not yet worthy of trust. From that point on, I began to reduce my presence. I spoke less, shared less. I did what was required, but no more than that. I didn't want to draw attention because attention usually led to comparison. I believed that if I stood far enough away, I wouldn't feel the pain of being placed next to my brother anymore. But the truth was, the more I tried to stay outside, the emptier I felt. I didn't know what I was good at, what I wanted. Every path seemed clearly laid out for Ethan, while I struggled to find a direction no one pointed out to me. I started to wonder whether something was wrong with me, or whether I had simply never been seen through a fair lens. One night, I sat alone in my room, looking at Ethan's certificates hanging in the hallway. I wasn't jealous. I just felt small. And in that moment, I understood that these comparisons weren't only killing my confidence, they were quietly taking away my childhood. I didn't cry. I simply accepted that if I wanted to exist in my own way, I would probably have to leave this comparison behind entirely. That thought didn't take me anywhere immediately, but it planted a seed in me, the seed of no longer trying to be like someone else. And even though at that time I didn't know who I would become, I began to understand that I couldn't continue living as a faded version of my brother forever. The day I left Plano to go to college in Austin, there weren't many words of advice. My father simply said that I should take responsibility for my choice. My mother hugged me quickly, as if prolonging it would make things awkward. Ethan wished me luck, in the tone of someone who had never doubted that he would be fine. I sat in the car, watching the familiar roads fade behind me, and for the first time felt both free and abandoned. The University of Texas at Austin was large and vibrant. Historic buildings, lawns filled with students, loud evenings that stretched on. I entered that place hoping that distance would allow me to become someone else. No longer the son standing behind. No longer Ethan's younger brother. Just Owen. But I quickly realized that what I carried with me wasn't only a suitcase of clothes, but the doubt that had been rooted in me for years. The first months weren't too bad. I attended classes, made a few friends, tried to blend in. But whenever I struggled, I heard the familiar voice in my head, reminding me that I was always the slower one, the lesser one. I didn't know how to ask for help. I also didn't know how to fail in a healthy way. Every grade that fell short made me feel like I was confirming what my family had always believed. I called home less often. The calls were short, filled with surface-level information. My father asked whether I was keeping up with the coursework. My mother asked whether I was eating properly. No one asked if I was okay. I didn't say it either. I didn't want to hear the silence on the other end of the line. the silence I had grown too familiar with. Meanwhile, Ethan kept moving forward. Stories about him reached me through those rare conversations. Good internships, wide connections, a clear future. I listened and nodded, as if those things didn't touch me. But every time I hung up, I felt that the distance between us wasn't only geographical. It was the distance between someone who was trusted and someone who still had to prove himself. The pressure gradually built up. I started missing a few classes. I told myself it was temporary. But temporary stretched on, and the gaps in my schedule began to reflect the gaps inside me. I didn't hate the university. I hated the feeling that no matter where I was still chasing a standard that wasn't meant for me. The moment everything collapsed wasn't loud. It came in a phone call from my father, after he received a notice from the school about my academic performance. He didn't yell. He just sighed. He said he was disappointed, that he had hoped I would do better. Those words weren't new. But in that context, they became the final cut. I realized that no matter how hard I tried, the image of me in his eyes would always be an unfinished version. After that call, I sat alone for a long time. I looked out of the dorm window, watching other students laugh and walk by, as if their lives weren't weighed down by invisible expectations. I wondered what would happen if I disappeared from those expectations. Not dying, but withdrawing completely. No explanations, no arguments, just stepping out of a role I had never been chosen for. That thought scared me, but it also relieved me. For the first time, I allowed myself to think that this failure wasn't the end, but an exit. I began to imagine a life where I didn't have to report results to anyone, didn't have to prove my worth through grades or my family's approval. I didn't make the decision immediately, but from that day on, I began organizing myself inwardly. I finished what remained of the semester, not with the hope of being recognized, but to close a chapter. I gradually stopped calling home. Not out of anger, but because I no longer knew what to say. Every call only reminded me that I was living a life no one truly cared about. One evening I sat on my bed, a backpack and a few essential items in front of me. I opened my laptop and searched for trips leaving Austin. When I saw the word California, my heart beat faster. I didn't know what was waiting for me there. I only knew that if I stayed, I would continue to become the failed version others were used to thinking of me as. I booked the ticket in silence. No announcements, no goodbyes, no clear plan. Just one very clear feeling inside me. If I didn't save myself at that moment, no one else would do it for me. And so, in the greatest failure of my life, I began preparing to disappear. The day I arrived in San Jose, there was no sense of beginning. No excitement, no grand hope. There was only one very clear feeling. I had left the place that had made me shrink. This city was noisy, expensive, and indifferent. I rented a small room in an old building where the sound of traffic never stopped and people lived close together but never asked each other's names. For the first time in my life, I felt that anonymity was a form of safety. The first days passed slowly. I did whatever work I could find. Warehouse assistants, deliveries, night shifts at a convenience store. No one asked who I used to be. No one knew where I came from. I carried boxes, cleaned floors, stood behind counters, and earned just enough to pay rent and buy food. Every night, I returned to my room exhausted, but without the feeling of being judged. That exhaustion was mine, and because of that, it felt lighter. I didn't call home, not out of anger, but because I didn't know what to say. If I said I was fine, it would be a lie. If I said I wasn't, I didn't know what I would receive on the other end of the line. The silence stretched on and then became a habit. There were no calls back. I noted it, but it no longer hurt the way I thought it would. There were nights when I lay on the narrow bed, staring at the stained ceiling, wondering whether I was running away. Leaving my family, leaving the old path, coming to a place where no one knew me. But every time that thought appeared, I remembered the suffocating feeling of living inside comparison. If this was running away, then it was the first time I was running towards space to breathe. I began building small routines, waking up early, tracking expenses, setting aside time each evening to study. I didn't set big goals. I just needed to move forward slowly enough not to turn back. I studied practical things, skills that could be used immediately. Each time I understood something new, I felt like I was placing a brick for something that didn't yet have a clear shape, but was mine. There were moments when I envied people who had family nearby, shared meals, a place to return to. But that envy didn't last. I realized I had something else. The right to decide who I was, without comparison. No one placed me next to anyone else. No one told me who I should be like. In that absence, I began to hear my own voice, even though it was still weak and unfamiliar. One evening, after a long workday, I sat in my room and realized that I hadn't thought about Ethan for days. The comparison that once occupied my mind was now only a distant memory. That realization scared me for a moment, then relieved me. If I no longer measured myself against someone else, I would have to take full responsibility for who I became. And that responsibility, though heavy, was something I chose. I didn't become strong immediately. I still doubted, still felt tired, still had days when I wanted to return to my old life simply because it was familiar. But every time that thought appeared, I remembered that familiar didn't mean safe. At least here, I didn't have to make myself smaller to fit someone else's expectations. I began to understand that disappearing from my family wasn't a dramatic act. It happened very slowly, in each day I didn't call, each story that wasn't told. But within that disappearance, I was gradually appearing to myself. Not a better version right away, but a truer one. One morning as I stood waiting for the bus to work, I watched people pass by and suddenly realized that none of them knew I had once been looked down on. None of them knew I had lived under someone else's shadow. To them, I was simply someone trying to get by. And for the first time, that was enough. I don't know what my future will look like. I don't have a grand plan, no promises to myself beyond continuing to move forward. But I know one thing very clearly. I have stopped waiting to be chosen. I have stepped out of the comparison, and in the quiet of this unfamiliar city, I have begun to exist in a way I was never allowed to before. Life in San Jose didn't suddenly change just because I had grown used to it. This city doesn't reward patience with quick results. Everything happens slowly, and sometimes cruelly. But it was precisely that slowness that forced me to look directly at myself, leaving no room to hide in comparison or in other people's expectations. I kept working, kept studying, and kept living in a rhythm so repetitive that at times I wondered whether I was stuck. But whenever that thought appeared, I realized that the biggest difference between the present and the past was this. I was choosing this path. No one was forcing me to become any version of myself. No one was standing behind me to judge whether I had done enough. I began to notice small changes in the way I thought. When I made mistakes at work, I no longer panicked. I fixed them. When I didn't understand something, I allowed myself to learn slowly. I no longer heard the old voice in my head, the voice that used to say I was always the lesser one. In its place was a new silence, not empty, but full of potential. There were days when I worked 12 hours straight. When I returned to my room, I was too tired to think. But within that exhaustion, I felt that I was truly living. Not living to be recognized, but living to exist and move forward. I began to understand that strength doesn't come from proving yourself to others, but from no longer needing to prove yourself at all. I still didn't call home, and they didn't call me either. The silence between us lasted long enough that I no longer expected it to be broken. Sometimes I wondered whether they thought I was failing, but then I realized that the answer no longer mattered. If they believed I was weak, that was a belief they had carried for a long time. I wasn't obligated to correct it. One evening, while checking my bank account, I realized that I had saved a small amount of money. Not much, but it was money I had earned myself, in silence, without anyone witnessing it. That moment made me stop for a long time. I realized that for the first time in my life, I was building something that wasn't based on comparison with anyone else. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid. I began to think about the future, not as a race, but as a series of choices. I didn't need to be faster than Ethan. I didn't need to prove to my father that he was wrong. I just needed to keep walking at my own pace. That thought gave me a sense of freedom I had never known before. At times, I missed home. Not the conversations, but the feeling of belonging somewhere. But whenever that longing surfaced, I reminded myself that belonging cannot be built on being looked down on. I could miss it, but I didn't need to return. Gradually, I realized that I was no longer the child always standing behind. Not because I had surpassed anyone, but because I had stepped out of the line. I no longer measured myself by my family's gaze. I measured myself by whether I could get up and continue each day. And most days, I could. One night, sitting alone in my room, I thought about the years before and realized that without being overlooked, I might never have learned how to stand on my own. That thought didn't make me grateful for the pain, but it helped me place the pain in its proper position. It was part of the journey, not the entirety of who I was. I hadn't become successful by any grand definition. I had no status, nothing to boast about. But I had something I had never had before: respect for myself. And within that quiet respect, I began to grow in a way no one in my family had ever seen. I knew my family was facing trouble not because they called me, but because a familiar name suddenly appeared in my current life. A colleague asked me if I knew Ethan Parker. He said that name had come up in a not-so-positive story related to work. I listened, nodded, and didn't ask for more. But from that moment, I knew that the years of stability in my family had begun to crack. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel pain either. The only feeling was a cold calmness, as if I were standing outside an old house, watching the roof I once lived under begin to leak. I didn't rush in. I didn't walk away. I just stood there and observed. Small fragments of information gradually came together. Ethan's career was no longer smooth. A wrong decision, an excess of confidence, and a system that had long been accustomed to supporting him began to pull its hands away. My father, the man who always believed he controlled everything, started to falter. The relationships he once relied on were no longer solid. Answers that used to come quickly now arrived slowly. I knew these things not because anyone told me, but because I had learned how this world operates. When someone has been favored for too long, they are often not taught how to stand on their own. And when the foundation shakes, confusion appears first, not strength. One evening I received a message from my mother. Just a short question. "How have you been lately?" I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I understood that the question didn't come from curiosity. It came from worry. And for the first time in my life, that worry was directed toward me. I replied that I was fine. No more, no less. My mother didn't ask further. But I knew that from that moment on, I had returned to the family's map. Not as a child who needed guidance, but as a possibility that had never been seriously considered. After that message, the familiar silences became different. I began to notice a shift in the way my family sought information. No longer boasting, but probing. No longer certain, but cautious. I wasn't asked directly, but my existence started to become visible in a very strange way. I didn't initiate contact, not because I wanted revenge, but because I didn't want to break the balance I had worked so hard to build. I understood that if I stepped in now with old emotions, I would be pulled back into my old role. And I no longer had the strength to live that again. At times I wondered whether I should feel pity. After all, they were still my family. But then I realized that compassion doesn't mean sacrificing myself. I could understand, but I didn't need to return to fix things I had never broken. One day I received a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, my father's voice came through. He said my name slowly, as if testing whether it still belonged to him. He didn't circle around the issue. He said the family was facing difficulties, that he needed to talk to me. Not an order, not an expectation, but a cautious request. I listened without responding right away. In that moment, I realized that our roles had truly reversed. The man who had always evaluated me was now waiting for my response. The man who had believed I wouldn't amount to much now needed the stability I had quietly built. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no either. I only said that I needed time. When the call ended, I sat still for a long while. Not to decide whether to help or not, but to identify my own feelings. I wasn't angry. I wasn't happy. I only saw a very clear boundary forming in front of me. For the first time, I understood that my true strength didn't lie in my family needing me, but in the fact that I had the right to choose. I could step in, or I could stay out. And whichever I chose, I was no longer the child standing behind, waiting to be seen. The meeting was arranged faster than I expected. There weren't many explanations, just a brief request from my father. He wanted to talk in person. I agreed, not because I felt obligated, but because I knew there were things that could only be closed by facing them. I flew back to Texas on a late afternoon, carrying a strange feeling, as if I were returning to a place that had once been very familiar, but no longer belonged to me. The house in Plano was the same. The lawn was trimmed, the door repainted. Everything looked even better than before. I stood in front of the door for a few seconds before ringing the bell. Not because I was nervous, but because I was wondering which emotions I needed to carry inside with me. When the door opened, my mother stood there. She looked at me for a long time, then hugged me. The hug was tighter than I remembered, but also more awkward. I returned it, just enough. We sat down in the living room. My father sat across from me, back straight, hands clasped together. Ethan sat slightly to the side, silent. No one began immediately. The silence stretched, heavy, but it no longer made me uncomfortable. I realized that I was no longer the one who needed to break it. My father spoke first. He said the family had gone through a difficult period, that there were things he hadn't anticipated. He didn't go into details, only said enough for me to understand that the certainty that once defined him was gone. As he spoke, I didn't hear the familiar, commanding tone. I heard exhaustion. My mother continued, her voice softer. She said she had been thinking a lot about me, that she regretted not asking about me more. Those words came late, but they weren't false. I listened without interrupting. I realized that if this had been years earlier, I would have clung to those words like a lifeline. Now, I simply acknowledged them as truths being spoken. Ethan finally looked at me. He said he had never thought things would turn out this way, that he had been used to everything always going right. I saw in his eyes not arrogance, but confusion. For the first time, I saw him as someone who was lost, not the perfect figure I had always been placed next to. Then it was my turn to speak. I hadn't prepared anything. I just said what I had come to understand about myself. I said that I hadn't left to punish anyone, but to save myself. That I had lived for many years with the feeling that I was always missing something, and I didn't want to continue like that. I said that I didn't blame them, but I also couldn't return to my old role. No one argued. My father looked down for a long time. Then he apologized. Not at length, not with excuses, just a short, awkward but sincere apology. I listened and nodded. I didn't feel relief or victory. I just felt that things had finally been called by their proper names. The conversation gradually moved toward what everyone knew was coming. My family needed help, not in the form of begging, but in the way of people who no longer had many options. I listened to their request, word by word. I realized that in the past, I had waited for a moment like this to prove my worth. But when it actually arrived, I no longer needed it. I stated my boundaries clearly. I said that I could consider helping, within my capacity and on my terms, but I would not return to the old comparisons. I would not allow vague expectations to define me again. What I said wasn't harsh, but it was firm. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to apologize for it. When the meeting ended, the atmosphere was still heavy, but no longer unclear. We had said what needed to be said, not to return to how things were, but to understand that we would never be the same again. As I stood up to leave, my mother asked whether I would call home more often. I said that I would call when I was ready. On the way to the airport, I looked at the city tied to my childhood and realized that I was no longer angry with it. I no longer longed to belong to it either. I carried a new calm with me. I had faced the past, not to let it pull me back, but to leave it standing behind me. I returned to San Jose on an early morning when the city was still half asleep. There was no sense of escape and no sense of victory either. It was simply a return to the right place. I pulled my suitcase along familiar sidewalks, walked through streets where I had learned to slow down, and realized that I wasn't carrying anything unresolved. Everything was in its proper place. The meeting with my family didn't leave behind the dramatic aftermath I had imagined during the years of silence. There were no prolonged tears, no grand promises of change, only belated words and necessary silences. I didn't blame them for not becoming the family I needed. I simply understood that they had done what they knew how to do, within their own limits. In the days that followed, I returned to my old rhythm. Work, studying, simple meals, quiet evenings. Nothing had changed on the outside. But inside, I felt lighter. I no longer carried the question, why am I not enough? That question had lost its right to exist the moment I stopped looking for the answer from other people. I thought about Ethan, not with the familiar sense of comparison, but as thinking about someone on a different path. I no longer needed to prove that I could be like him, or surpass him. We were two separate lives, and that separation finally brought me peace. My parents were still there, with their limitations and habits. I didn't expect them to change completely. I didn't need them to see me differently to feel that I had value. If they learned something from my absence, that was their choice, not my responsibility. At times, I wondered whether I should call home more often. But then I realized that connection cannot come from guilt. It only has meaning when both sides are ready to see each other as independent people. I left that door open, but I didn't stand in front of it waiting. One evening, sitting alone in my room, I remembered the image of the boy I once was, sitting silently at the dinner table, trying not to draw attention. I looked at that boy with a different gaze. Not pity, not blame. Just an acknowledgement that he had done his best to survive in an environment that wasn't built for him. I understood that strength doesn't come from being chosen in the end. It comes from no longer needing to be chosen. When I disappeared from the comparison, I gave myself the chance to exist fully. Not to prove that I was the strongest, but to live without shrinking myself. My family may have realized my value when I was no longer there. But by the time they did, I was no longer standing in my old place. I didn't turn my back on them with resentment. I simply moved forward, with clear boundaries and intact self-respect. If there is one thing I learned from this journey, it is this. Being left behind does not define you as weak. Sometimes, it is simply the condition that allows you to learn how to stand on your own. I don't know what the future will bring, but I know for certain that I will not return to living in the role of someone waiting to be recognized. I continue living, quietly, without display. I don't need anyone to call my name to know that I exist. I am here, in my own life. And for the first time, that is enough.